The stones flew like angry birds through the morning air, each one finding its mark on Selvara's broad shoulders and towering frame. She stood 7 feet tall in the town square of Calethorn, her weathered dress hanging loose around her gaunt body, while children no higher than her waist hurled rocks and shouted words that cut deeper than any blade. Cursed witch, death bringer, giant freak. The largest stone caught her temple, sending warm blood trickling down her cheek. Selvara did not flinch. She had learned that moving, crying, or fighting back only made them throw harder. The crowd of adults watched from their shop doorways and windows, some with satisfaction, others with the uncomfortable silence of people who knew they should stop cruelty but chose comfort instead. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know where in the world you are following Selvara's story. Don't just sit back, tell me your location. Now, let's dive deeper into this tale. Mayor Hendrik Voss stepped forward, his round belly straining against his gold-buttoned vest. His small eyes glittered with the kind of cruel joy that comes from having power over someone who cannot fight back. In his pudgy hands, he held a scroll that would seal Selvara's fate. By order of the Calethorn Town Council, Voss announced, his voice carrying across the square like the toll of a funeral bell. Selvara Grimwald is hereby given 7 days to settle all debts owed by her late husband, or face immediate seizure of property and exile from these lands. The crowd murmured with approval. 7 days to find money that did not exist, to pay debts she had never made, for a husband who had died 3 months ago under circumstances the town refused to investigate. Selvara's hands trembled at her sides, not from fear, but from the rage she kept locked inside her chest like a caged beast. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, picked up another stone. His mother should have stopped him, but instead she whispered encouragement in his ear. The rock struck Selvara's knee, and this time, she did stumble. The crowd cheered as if they had witnessed a great victory. The curse will follow her wherever she goes. Old Martha Crenshaw cackled from her bakery doorway. Mark my words, that giant brings nothing but death and ruin. Look what happened to poor Bjorn. Selvara's heart clenched at the mention of her husband's name. Bjorn had been the only person in Calethorn who saw her as more than a freak of nature. He had loved her gentle hands and quiet voice, the way she could reach the highest shelves and carry the heaviest loads. He had made her feel human. Now he was dead, and she was alone among people who believed her very existence was a plague upon their town. Mayor Voss rolled up his scroll with theatrical precision. 7 days, giant woman. Find the money, or find yourself a new place to die. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the spectacle they had witnessed, Selvara remained standing in the square. Blood dripped from her temple onto the cobblestones beneath her feet. Her stomach cramped with hunger she had been ignoring for days. The small cottage she and Bjorn had called home would soon belong to strangers. But something else stirred within her chest, something that had been growing stronger each day since Bjorn's funeral. It was not hope, exactly, but it was not surrender either. It was the quiet determination of a woman who had endured too much to simply lie down and die. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky had been clear moments before. Several townspeople glanced upward with nervous expressions. Strange weather had been following Selvara like a shadow ever since Bjorn's death, and the people of Calethorn were beginning to notice. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Selvara turned toward home. But before she took a single step, she noticed him. A stranger stood at the far edge of the square, partially hidden in the shadow of the old oak tree. He was tall, though not as tall as her, with dark clothes and darker eyes that seemed to see everything. He had been watching the entire humiliation unfold, and unlike everyone else, his face showed no satisfaction or fear. Instead, there was something that looked almost like anger. The stranger stepped forward into the light, and Selvara felt her breath catch in her throat. Because in that moment, as rain began to fall harder and the townspeople scattered for cover, she realized that everything was about to change. 6 months earlier, Selvara Grimwald had been happy. The memory felt like touching a warm stone pulled from fire, beautiful but painful to hold. She stood in her empty kitchen now, staring at the wooden table where Bjorn used to read his morning letters, where they had shared countless meals and quiet conversations about dreams that would never come true. The cottage felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. Every corner held pieces of their life together. His leather boots still sat by the door, too large for any normal man, but perfect for someone who had loved a giant woman without shame. His coffee cup remained unwashed in the basin, a brown ring staining the bottom like a memory she could not scrub away. Selvara traced her fingers along the table's worn edge, remembering the day Bjorn had surprised her with news that still made her chest tight with grief and rage. He had burst through the door that autumn afternoon, his weathered face glowing with excitement, holding a letter that would change everything. "Selvara, my love," he had said, lifting her clean off her feet despite her impressive height and weight. "We are not as poor as we thought. My uncle Erasmus has died, and he has left us something wonderful." The letter had been official, stamped with the seal of Erasmus Grimwald's estate. Bjorn's uncle, a man neither of them had ever met, had owned a significant piece of land on the outskirts of Calethorn. Rich farming soil, a small forest, and a stream that never ran dry. The inheritance was enough to change their lives completely. But within days of receiving that letter, strange things began happening to Bjorn. He started coughing blood. His appetite disappeared, and his skin took on a yellow, sickly color that reminded Selvara of old parchment. The town doctor, a nervous man named Cornelius Drake, had examined Bjorn with shaking hands and declared the illness a mystery. "Perhaps it is something he caught from his wife," Dr. Drake had whispered to Mayor Voss, loud enough for Selvara to hear. "Giant blood carries strange diseases. Everyone knows this." Selvara had wanted to grab the small man by his collar and shake him until his teeth rattled. Instead, she had focused all her energy on caring for Bjorn, feeding him soup and reading to him from the adventure books he loved. She had held his hand through long nights when fever made him speak to people who were not there. The inheritance papers had disappeared from their home during Bjorn's final week. Selvara had torn the cottage apart looking for them, but they were gone as completely as if they had never existed. When she asked Dr. Drake about filing a report, he had looked at her with disgust and suggested that perhaps she had imagined the whole thing. "Grief does strange things to the mind," he had said, "especially minds that are already touched by strangeness." Now, standing in her kitchen with Mayor Voss's ultimatum echoing in her ears, Selvara understood the truth with crystal clarity. Bjorn had not died from mysterious illness. He had been murdered, slowly and carefully, by people who wanted his inheritance. And she, the giant widow, was the perfect scapegoat for their crime. A knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. Selvara's heart jumped with hope that quickly died. No one in Calethorn visited her anymore, not since Bjorn's funeral when she had stood alone beside his grave while the entire town watched from a distance. She opened the door to find Thomas Blackwood, the town's most successful merchant, standing on her doorstep with two larger men flanking him like trained dogs. Thomas was a handsome man in his 40s with silver threading through his dark hair and clothes that cost more than most families earned in a year. "Selvara," Thomas said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "I hope you are well. I have come to discuss your husband's debts." The word debts hit her like a physical blow. "What debts? Bjorn never borrowed money from you." Thomas pulled a leather folder from inside his coat and opened it with theatrical precision. "I am afraid that is not true. Your husband came to me 3 months ago, desperate for money to pay for medical treatments. He borrowed heavily against future earnings from his inheritance." Selvara stared at the papers Thomas held, her mind reeling. The handwriting looked like Bjorn's, but something about it seemed wrong. The letters were too careful, too perfect, as if someone had practiced copying his signature many times. "He borrowed 5,000 gold marks," Thomas continued. "With interest, the debt now stands at 7,000. I have been patient out of respect for your loss, but patience has limits. 7,000 gold marks. The number was so large it might as well have been 7 million. Selvara had perhaps 20 copper pieces to her name, barely enough to buy bread for 3 days. Her job at the textile mill paid almost nothing, and even that income was threatened by the town's growing hostility toward her. "I do not have that money," Selvara said quietly. "I do not have any money." Thomas's smile widened, showing teeth that reminded her of a wolf's. "Then perhaps we can arrange something else. I hear you have been causing quite a disturbance in town lately. Curses, strange weather, accidents following in your wake. The people are frightened. One of Thomas's companions, a thick man with scars across his knuckles, cracked his fingers menacingly. The message was clear: pay the debt, or face consequences that would be much worse than public humiliation. 7 days, Thomas said, folding his papers and tucking them away. Find the money, or I will take everything you have left, starting with this cottage. As the three men walked away, Selvara closed the door and leaned against it, her legs suddenly weak. Through the window, she could see storm clouds gathering overhead, dark and heavy with the promise of more rain. But in the distance, barely visible through the approaching darkness, she spotted a figure standing near the old oak tree. The same stranger who had watched her humiliation in the town square. He was still there, still watching, and something about his presence made her feel less alone than she had in months. The stranger appeared at Calethorn's Inn on a Tuesday morning, riding a horse as black as midnight and carrying saddlebags that clinked with the sound of serious money. Innkeeper Magnus Hartwell nearly dropped his breakfast when the tall figure ducked through his doorway, water still dripping from a long coat that looked like it had traveled many miles. I need a room, the stranger said, his voice carrying an accent that Magnus could not place. And information about your town. Magnus studied the newcomer with the calculating eye of a man who had spent 40 years judging the worth of travelers. This one was different. His clothes were well made, but not flashy. His boots expensive, but worn from real use. Most telling were his hands, which looked strong enough to break bones, but clean enough to belong to a gentleman. Information costs extra, Magnus said carefully, testing the waters. Depends what kind you are seeking. The stranger placed a gold coin on the wooden counter, more money than Magnus usually saw in a week. Tell me about the giant woman. Selvara Grimwald. Magnus felt his stomach tighten with unease. Strangers asking about Selvara meant trouble, and trouble was bad for business. But the gold coin gleamed too brightly to ignore, and Magnus had a family to feed. She is cursed, Magnus whispered, leaning forward conspiratorially. Brings death wherever she goes. Her husband died 3 months back, strange and sudden-like. Ever since then, accidents follow her like hungry dogs. Roof tiles fall when she walks beneath them. Horses bolt when she comes near. Crops wither in fields she passes. The stranger's dark eyes showed no fear, only interest. What kind of accidents? Magnus counted them on his thick fingers, warming to his story. Young Peter Moss broke his leg the day after he threw mud at her. Sarah Wickham's best milk cow died of bloat after she refused to serve Selvara at market. 3 different men have fallen from ladders the week after they called her names in public. Interesting, the stranger murmured. And before her husband's death? Was she considered cursed then? The question caught Magnus off guard. He paused, thinking back, and realized with uncomfortable surprise that Selvara had lived in Calethorn for nearly 2 years without anyone speaking of curses or supernatural misfortune. Well, Magnus said slowly, she was always strange, you understand. Too tall, too quiet. People talked, the way people do. But the real trouble, the curse talk, that started after Bjorn passed. The stranger nodded and placed another gold coin beside the first. I want to know about her husband's death. Everything you heard. Magnus glanced around the empty inn, then leaned closer. Bjorn Grimwald was a good man, well-liked despite his choice of wife. Worked hard, paid his debts, never caused trouble. Then he got sick, fast and brutal. Started coughing blood, could not keep food down, skin turned the color of old cheese. What did the doctor say? Dr. Drake. Magnus snorted with contempt. That fool would not know real medicine if it bit him on his skinny rear. Said it was a mystery illness, maybe something Bjorn caught from his giant wife. But between you and me, stranger, Bjorn's symptoms looked mighty familiar. The stranger raised an eyebrow, inviting Magnus to continue. My own father died the same way, 20 years back, Magnus said quietly. Coughing blood, yellow skin, wasting away to nothing. Only difference was, we knew what killed him. Rat poison in his evening ale, put there by my uncle who wanted the family farm. The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke. The stranger absorbed this information without apparent surprise, as if he had suspected such things all along. Who benefits from Bjorn's death? The stranger asked. Magnus counted on his fingers again, but this time his expression was grim. Thomas Blackwood gets to collect on debts that may or may not be real. Mayor Voss gets to look strong by driving out the cursed giant. Dr. Drake gets paid handsomely for keeping his mouth shut about what he really saw. And whoever wanted Bjorn's inheritance gets it free and clear, since Selvara will be gone or dead within the week. What inheritance? Bjorn's uncle left him land. Good farming land with water rights and mineral claims. Worth more than most folks in Kalethorn will see in their lifetimes. The inheritance papers disappeared right around the time Bjorn started coughing blood. The stranger stood, leaving both gold coins on the counter. One more question. The accidents that follow Selvara, do they happen to everyone who mistreats her, or only certain people? Magnus thought carefully before answering. Only certain ones. The worst ones, if you understand my meaning. People who hurt her out of real cruelty, not just fear or ignorance. Thank you for the information, the stranger said. If anyone asks, we discussed the weather and the road conditions. Magnus nodded and pocketed the coins quickly. What name shall I put in the register? Aldrich Thorn. After Aldrich left the inn, Magnus stood at his window, watching the tall figure walk toward the town square. Something about the stranger made him nervous, but it was a different kind of nervousness than Selvara inspired. This was the feeling a mouse gets when it realizes there is a hunting cat in the area, but the cat is hunting something much larger and more dangerous than mice. Magnus had lived in Kalethorn his entire life. He knew which families had old grudges, which merchants cheated their customers, and which officials could be bought for the right price. He also knew that sometimes, when a town became too comfortable with its own cruelty, the universe sent correction. As he watched Aldrich Thorn disappear around the corner, Magnus had the distinct feeling that Kalethorn was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between justice and revenge. Outside, thunder rumbled again, though the sky was clear. Magnus shivered and closed his shutters against whatever storm was coming. Selvara's hands shook as she counted her meager coins for the third time, hoping somehow the copper pieces would multiply through sheer desperation. 23 coppers and a handful of brass tokens from the textile mill. Not enough to buy bread for a week, let alone pay a debt that might not even exist. The textile mill's morning whistle shrieked across Kalethorn like a wounded bird, calling workers to another day of endless labor for wages that barely sustained life. Selvara wrapped her threadbare shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the gray dawn, knowing this might be her last day of employment. Mill supervisor Jaren Foss, Mayor Voss's younger brother, waited for her at the factory gates with an expression of barely contained disgust. He was a small, wiry man who compensated for his lack of height by wielding what little authority he possessed like a club. You are late, giant, Jaren spat, though Selvara had arrived at exactly the same time she had every day for the past 18 months. I am sorry, sir, Selvara replied quietly, lowering her eyes in the submissive gesture that sometimes prevented worse treatment. Inside the mill, the massive looms thundered and clattered in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The air was thick with cotton dust that coated everything in a fine white powder, making breathing difficult and conversation impossible. Selvara took her position at the largest loom, the only one built to accommodate someone of her unusual height. For 2 hours, she worked in relative peace, her skilled hands guiding thread with the precision that came from months of practice. The work was mindless but satisfying, one of the few places where her size was an advantage rather than a curse. She could reach parts of the machinery that required ladders for normal-sized workers. Then the whispers started. Look how she makes the whole building shake when she walks, hissed Anna Darkwada, a bitter woman whose husband had left her for a younger bride. Earthquake follows her footsteps. My sister said the giant woman cursed her baby, added Elena Marsh, raising her voice to be heard over the machinery. Little Clara has been crying every night since Selvara looked at her in the market. Selvara kept her eyes focused on the loom, pretending not to hear, but her hands began to tremble with suppressed rage. Baby Clara had been crying because she was hungry. Elena's family could barely afford food, a fact everyone in Kalethorn knew but no one mentioned. She killed her own husband with witchcraft, declared Miriam Stone, the mill's most vicious gossip. Fed him giant woman's blood to make him strong, but it poisoned him instead. The lie was so outrageous that Selvara stopped working. She turned to face Miriam, her full height, making the smaller woman step backward instinctively. That is not true, Selvara said, her voice carrying clearly over the mechanical noise. I love my husband. I would never hurt him. Love. Miriam laughed harshly. What would a monster like you know about love? Poor Bjorn was probably trying to find a way to escape when the curse killed him. Something inside Selvara's chest cracked like ice under pressure. The careful control she had maintained for months began to slip, and with it came a rage so pure and powerful it made her vision blur red around the edges. Take that back, Selvara said, stepping toward Miriam. Take it back now. Miriam's face went pale, but she was surrounded by other women who shared her cruelty, and their presence made her bold. I will not take back the truth, giant witch. Everyone knows you are cursed, and everyone knows you killed him. Selvara's hands clenched into fists large enough to crush skulls. For one terrifying moment, she imagined grabbing Miriam by the throat and lifting her off the ground, squeezing until the lies stopped flowing from her poisonous mouth. Instead, she turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd of workers who scattered before her like leaves in a storm wind. Running away? Giant, Miriam called after her. Just like you will run when Thomas Blackwood comes to collect his money? Selvara burst through the mill's front doors into the morning sunlight, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Behind her, she could hear Jaren Foss shouting about abandoned workstations and docked wages, but she no longer cared. The mill job was lost anyway. Her reputation, her home, her future in Calethorn were all forfeit. As she stood in the dusty street outside the mill, trying to calm her racing heart, she noticed him again. Aldrich Thorne stood across the square, partially hidden by the shadow of a merchant's cart, but his dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and protected at the same time. This time, instead of simply watching, he began walking toward her. Selvara's first instinct was to flee. Strange men approaching her never brought good news, and she had endured enough humiliation for one morning. But something about Aldrich's steady gait and calm expression made her stay rooted to the spot. He stopped 3 paces away, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to avoid threatening her personal space. Up close, she could see details that distance had hidden. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by small scars that suggested a life of action rather than comfort. His clothes, while well-made, showed signs of hard travel. "Miss Grimwald," he said, and his voice held a warmth that Selvara had not heard directed at her since Bjorn's death. "My name is Aldrich Thorne. I believe we need to talk." Thunder rumbled overhead again, and this time, several people in the square looked up at the clear sky with expressions of nervous confusion. The strange weather that had been following Selvara was becoming harder to ignore, and whispers of supernatural influence were spreading through Calethorn like wildfire. "I do not talk to strangers," Selvara said quietly, but she did not walk away. "Then it is fortunate," Aldrich replied with something that might have been a smile, "that I am not planning to remain a stranger for very long." Aldrich Thorne sat across from Selvara in the abandoned chapel on the outskirts of Calethorn, a place where broken pews and crumbling stone provided the only sanctuary left for the unwanted. Dust motes danced in colored light that filtered through stained glass windows depicting saints who had never visited this forgotten corner of the world. "Your husband was murdered," Aldrich said without preamble, his words cutting through the chapel's musty silence like a blade through silk. Selvara had suspected this truth for months, but hearing it spoken aloud still hit her like a physical blow. Her massive hands gripped the edge of the wooden pew until her knuckles turned white, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I know, but knowing and proving are different things." Aldrich reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a small glass vial filled with white powder. He held it up to the light, where it gleamed with an oily sheen that reminded Selvara of fish scales. "This is arsenic," he said calmly, "mixed with ground moonflower petals to mask the bitter taste. Very expensive, very effective, and almost impossible to detect unless you know exactly what to look for." Selvara stared at the vial with a mixture of fascination and horror. "Where did you get that?" "From Dr. Drake's private medicine chest, hidden behind his collection of anatomy books, along with detailed notes about dosage amounts and symptoms to expect." Aldrich's dark eyes hardened to the consistency of winter ice. "Your husband was poisoned slowly over the course of 3 weeks, probably through his evening ale." The words unlocked a flood of memories that Selvara had tried to suppress. Bjorn's favorite tavern, where he went every night after work to drink one mug of ale and discuss the day's events with other working men. How the illness had started gradually, with just a loss of appetite and mild stomach pain. How it had progressed exactly as Aldrich described, with mathematical precision. Who? Selvara asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Thomas Blackwood owns the tavern. Dr. Drake provided the poison and documented the symptoms to make the death appear natural. Mayor Voss helped by refusing to investigate when you asked for an inquiry. Selvara felt something cold and dangerous unfurling in her chest, like a serpent that had been sleeping too long. Why? Why kill Bjorn? Aldrich pulled out a leather folder containing documents that looked official and expensive. Because your husband inherited more than just land from his uncle Erasmus. He inherited mineral rights to a copper mine that has been producing steadily for 12 years. Income of approximately 15,000 gold marks annually. The number was so large that Selvara could not immediately comprehend it. 15,000 gold marks per year was enough to buy a small kingdom, enough to live like royalty for multiple lifetimes. It was wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. The inheritance was legitimate, Aldrich continued, spreading the documents on the pew between them. Erasmus Grimwald was a successful mining investor who never married and had no children. Bjorn was his only living relative, which made the inheritance completely legal and binding. Selvara studied the papers with growing amazement. Her husband's signature appeared on multiple documents, but these were clearly authentic, lacking the careful perfection of the forgeries Thomas Blackwood had shown her. "But how do you know all this?" she asked. "Who are you?" Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. His gaze focused on the broken altar where someone had once spoken of justice and divine retribution. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Erasmus Grimwald was my business partner. We invested in mines together for 23 years, and he was the closest thing to a father I ever had. When he died, I promised to ensure his inheritance reached the right person." Understanding dawned on Selvara like sunrise after a long night. "You have been watching over Bjorn's inheritance. I have been watching over Bjorn, and now I am watching over you. When I learned of his death, I came to investigate. What I found was a conspiracy that goes deeper than simple greed." Aldrich pulled out more documents, these showing financial records and property deeds. "Thomas Blackwood has been systematically acquiring land and businesses throughout Calethorn by manufacturing debts against people who cannot fight back. He killed your husband to steal the mining rights, then created fake loan documents to claim your property as well." Selvara felt her anger transforming into something sharper and more focused. "What about the accidents? The things people say are my curse. Coincidence and guilty conscience," Aldrich said with grim satisfaction. "Though I may have helped some of those accidents along. Peter Moss broke his leg because I loosened the ladder he was using to hang insulting signs about you. Sarah Wickham's cow died because I fed it a mild poison after she spat on you in the marketplace." The revelation should have shocked Selvara, but instead it filled her with something she had not felt in months: hope. For the first time since Bjorn's death, she was not facing her enemies alone. "You have been protecting me," she said. "I have been evening the odds. But protection is temporary. What you need is justice, and justice requires proof that will stand up in a court of law." Aldrich gathered the documents back into his folder with careful precision. "Tomorrow, Thomas Blackwood will come for your cottage. He expects you to be helpless, desperate, and alone. I suggest we surprise him." Outside the chapel, storm clouds were gathering with unnatural speed, turning the afternoon sky dark as twilight. Lightning flickered in the distance, and thunder rolled across Calethorn like the footsteps of approaching giants. "What do you want in return?" Selvara asked, because in her experience, no one helped without expecting payment. Aldrich stood and shouldered his satchel, then looked at her with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. "I want to give you a choice that no one else has offered. When this is finished, when Thomas Blackwood and his conspirators are brought to justice, you can stay in Calethorn and reclaim your place here. Or you can leave with me and see what the world looks like when you are not the tallest person in every room." The offer hung between them like a bridge over a chasm, connecting her painful present to an uncertain but potentially beautiful future. For the first time in her adult life, Selvara Grimwald had options that extended beyond mere survival. "First," she said, rising to her full impressive height, Let us make Thomas Blackwood regret ever hearing my name." Thomas Blackwood arrived at Selvara's cottage the next morning with an army of witnesses and a wagon to haul away her belongings. Mayor Voss walked beside him, sweating despite the cool morning air, while Dr. Drake lingered at the back of the group like a man trying to hide from his own shadow. A dozen townspeople followed, drawn by the promise of entertainment and the chance to watch the giant woman's final humiliation. Selvara stood in her doorway, no longer the broken figure they expected to see. She had braided her long hair into a crown around her head, emphasizing her impressive height, and wore her best dress despite its patches and worn edges. But most unsettling of all was her expression, calm and confident where they had expected tears and desperation. "Thomas Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I have been expecting you." Thomas smiled his predator's smile and unfolded the forged documents with theatrical flourish. "Then you know why I am here. 7,000 gold marks, or everything you own becomes mine." "I know exactly why you are here," Selvara replied. "The question is whether these good people know the truth about your business practices." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the script they had expected. The giant woman was supposed to beg, to cry, to make them feel both superior and slightly guilty about their entertainment. Instead, she seemed to be preparing for battle. Thomas's smile flickered slightly, but he pressed forward. "Truth is simple, giant woman. Your husband borrowed money. You cannot pay it back, and now you face the consequences of his poor decisions." "My husband's name was Bjorn," Selvara said, stepping forward so that her shadow fell across Thomas like a dark prophecy. "And he never borrowed a copper piece from you. I have documents that say otherwise. You have forgeries. Very good ones, but forgeries nonetheless." Selvara reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "This is Bjorn's real handwriting. A love letter he wrote to me last winter. Compare the signature to your loan documents." She held the letter high enough for the crowd to see, and even from a distance, the difference was obvious. Bjorn's natural handwriting was loose and flowing, full of personality and small imperfections. The signatures on Thomas's documents were rigid and careful, the work of someone copying rather than writing naturally. Thomas's face darkened with anger. "Handwriting proves nothing. Perhaps your husband learned to write more carefully when signing important documents." "Perhaps," Selvara agreed. "But this proves everything." From behind her cottage stepped Aldrich Thorne, carrying a leather folder that seemed to make Thomas Blackwood's blood turn to ice water. The merchant's face went from red to pale so quickly that several people in the crowd gasped with surprise. "Thomas Blackwood," Aldrich said, his voice cutting through the morning air like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and murder." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Murder was a serious accusation, far beyond the simple debt collection they had come to witness. Mayor Voss stepped forward, puffing up his chest with borrowed authority. "Who do you think you are, stranger? You have no power to arrest anyone in Calethorn." Aldrich reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document bearing impressive seals and ribbons. "I am a deputy investigator for the Royal Ministry of Justice, commissioned to investigate financial crimes in rural districts. And I have evidence that Mr. Blackwood murdered Bjorn Grimwald to steal his inheritance." Dr. Drake tried to slip away from the back of the crowd, but two men Selvara had never seen before stepped out from behind her cottage to block his escape. They wore the blue uniforms of royal constables and carried the kind of weapons that discouraged resistance. "The evidence is quite damning," Aldrich continued, opening his folder to reveal the documents he had shown Selvara the previous day. Forged loan papers, stolen inheritance documents, and a detailed record of poison purchases found in Dr. Drake's private notes. Thomas Blackwood's composed mask finally cracked completely. "This is nonsense. I am a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. You cannot believe the word of a cursed giant woman over mine." "I believe the evidence," Aldrich replied calmly, "which includes testimony from Magnus Hartwell about suspicious conversations he overheard, financial records showing unexplained wealth in your accounts, and a confession from Dr. Drake." All eyes turned to Dr. Drake, who looked like a man watching his own execution. His thin frame shook with terror, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "He made me do it," Drake whispered. "Thomas said if I did not help, He would destroy my practice and ruin my family. I never wanted anyone to die. The crowd's mood shifted like wind before a storm. Moments before, they had seen Thomas as a pillar of their community and Selvara as a dangerous outsider. Now those roles were reversing with dizzying speed. Thomas made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his position. Even if these accusations were true, which they are not, what does it matter? She is still a giant freak who brings bad luck wherever she goes. Calethorn is better off without her. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Selvara felt the moment when everything would be decided. She could see fear and uncertainty in the faces of the townspeople who had tormented her for months. They were realizing that their comfortable cruelty had been built on lies, and that knowledge made them dangerous. But before anyone could respond, the sky above them exploded with thunder so loud it shook window panes throughout Calethorn. Lightning split the clear morning air, and rain began falling in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. In the chaos that followed, as people scattered for shelter and shouted questions they could not answer, Selvara stood motionless in the storm. Water streamed down her face and soaked through her dress, but she felt cleaner than she had in months. When the rain finally stopped as suddenly as it had begun, Thomas Blackwood was gone. He had vanished in the confusion, leaving behind only his forged documents and his conspirators to face justice alone. But Selvara barely noticed his escape. She was staring at Aldrich Thorne, who stood in the sudden sunshine with water dripping from his dark hair, and she was finally beginning to understand that her real life was about to begin. Aldrich found Selvara sitting by Bjorn's grave as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. She had been there since dawn, he knew, because he had watched her walk to the small cemetery carrying wildflowers picked from the meadow beyond town. The headstone was simple carved granite, bearing only Bjorn's name and dates, but someone had recently cleared away the weeds and placed fresh stones around the border. "I brought you something," Aldrich said, settling onto the grass beside her with the careful movements of a man who understood grief's fragile geography. He held out a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of serious money. 15,000 gold marks. Your husband's inheritance, plus interest earned over the past 3 months. It belongs to you now. Selvara stared at the pouch without reaching for it. "I never wanted money. I only wanted justice for Bjorn in a place where people did not see me as a monster. You have justice now. Thomas Blackwood will be hunted across 3 kingdoms, and Dr. Drake will spend the next decade in royal prison. As for the other thing," Aldrich paused, choosing his words carefully, "that depends on what you want to do next." The cemetery was peaceful in the evening light, surrounded by oak trees that whispered secrets to the wind. In the distance, Calethorn looked almost beautiful, its cobblestone streets and tile roofs glowing warm in the sunset. But Selvara knew the truth that lay beneath that picturesque surface. "The townspeople are afraid of me now," she said quietly. "Not because they think I am cursed, but because they know I have power they cannot touch. That might be worse than their old hatred. Fear can become respect, given time. Or it can become something darker." Selvara touched Bjorn's headstone with fingers that trembled slightly. "They spent months convincing themselves I was evil so they could justify their cruelty. Learning they were wrong will not make them love me. It will make them hate themselves, and people who hate themselves always look for someone else to blame." Aldrich recognized the wisdom in her words. He had seen it before in other places where justice arrived too late to heal all the wounds it exposed. "So what will you do?" Selvara was quiet for a long moment, listening to the evening birds and the distant sound of church bells calling Calethorn's citizens to evening prayer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a certainty that had not been there before. "Tell me about this place you mentioned, where I would not be the tallest person in every room." "Valdres," Aldrich said, and even speaking the name seemed to lift some weight from his shoulders. "A city built in the mountains, where the air is thin and clear and the people are different, taller, stronger, more accepting of variations that other places fear." He pulled a small sketch from his pocket, drawn in careful detail on expensive paper. It showed a city of tall spires and graceful bridges, built into mountainsides and connected by roads that seemed to climb toward the clouds themselves. "My people," Aldrich continued, though the words seemed to require effort. "I left Valdres 20 years ago to make my fortune in the lowland cities. I told myself I was seeking adventure and opportunity, but the truth was simpler. I was running from expectations and responsibilities I was not ready to face. Selvara studied the sketch, noting how the buildings seemed designed for people much larger than those who lived in Calethorn. What kind of responsibilities? Leadership. My family has governed Valdris for 12 generations, and I was trained from birth to take my father's place when the time came. But I wanted to see the world first, to understand how other people lived before I committed to spending my life serving my own. The revelation explained much about Aldrich that had puzzled Selvara. His natural authority, his wealth, his ability to command royal constables and produce official documents. He was not just a successful merchant, as she had assumed, but nobility in exile. Your father must be disappointed in your long absence. My father died 3 years ago, Aldrich said simply. The Council of Elders has been governing Valdris in my absence, waiting for me to return and claim my inheritance. But I cannot go back alone. Selvara looked at him sharply, beginning to understand the deeper currents of his offer. Why not? Because Valdris law requires its leaders to be married. The city was founded by refugee families fleeing persecution in the lowlands, and our ancestors believed that only someone who understood the importance of family and community could properly govern others. The pieces of Aldrich's puzzle fell into place with almost audible clicks. His long search for Bjorn and his inheritance. His careful protection of Selvara during her darkest hours. His offer of escape to a place where she would belong. You need a wife, Selvara said. I need a partner, Aldrich corrected gently. Someone strong enough to help me govern a city, wise enough to make difficult decisions, and brave enough to stand beside me when those decisions prove unpopular. Selvara felt her heart begin to race, but not with fear. For the first time in her adult life, someone was asking her to be more than she was, not less. You barely know me. I know that you endured months of cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. I know that you loved your husband completely and grieved him honestly. I know that you are intelligent enough to see through Thomas Blackwood's deceptions and strong enough to face an angry crowd without flinching. Aldrich stood and offered her his hand, a gesture that seemed both formal and intimate. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Selvara. I am asking you to come with me to Valdris and see if you can imagine building a life there. With me, if that feels right, or on your own if you prefer. The offered hand represented everything Selvara had never dared to hope for. A chance to leave Calethorn's painful memories behind. A place where her height and strength would be assets rather than curses. A man who saw her as a potential partner rather than a fascinating oddity. But it also meant leaving Bjorn's grave, abandoning the cottage where they had been happy, and trusting her future to someone she had known for less than a week. Pack your bags, Aldrich said softly, as if reading her thoughts. Bring whatever matters most to you, but do not bring your pain. Valdris has mountains tall enough to dwarf any giant woman, and skies wide enough to hold all the dreams you have been afraid to dream. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but this time it sounded like applause rather than warning. Selvara looked at Bjorn's headstone one final time, then placed her hand in Aldrich's. When do we leave? She asked. Selvara stood in her cottage doorway at dawn, holding a canvas bag that contained everything she valued in the world. Bjorn's leather boots, too precious to leave behind. The blue dress he had bought her for their wedding, carefully folded between layers of tissue paper. His collection of adventure books, their pages worn soft from countless readings by lamplight. The letter he had written her last winter, promising they would travel together someday to see mountains and oceans. The rest she would leave for whoever needed it. Furniture built for normal-sized people, kitchen pots too small for her hands, curtains that had never quite fit the windows properly. Let the cottage hold memories for someone else now. Aldrich waited beside his black horse, checking the straps on a second mount he had acquired during the night. This one was a gentle gray mare with patient eyes, built strong enough to carry Selvara's impressive frame without strain. Saddlebags hung ready on both animals, packed with supplies for the long journey to Valdris. Second thoughts? Aldrich asked, noting her hesitation. Final thoughts, Selvara corrected. I am saying goodbye to the woman who lived here. She was not a bad person, but she was not brave enough to want more than survival. As if summoned by her words, a small crowd began gathering in the street outside her cottage. Mayor Voss stood at the front, his round face flushed with the kind of desperate embarrassment that comes from discovering your cruelty was built on lies. Behind him clustered the faces of people who had thrown stones, whispered curses, and made her life miserable for months. Selvara, Mayor Voss called out, his voice cracking like a boy's. We, that is, the town council, we would like to speak with you before you go. Selvara stepped outside, her full height casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The crowd instinctively moved backward, but this time their retreat looked more like respect than fear. We know we wronged you, Voss continued, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. The things we said, the things we did. We were frightened and confused, but that is no excuse for treating you as we did. Anna Darkwada, the bitter woman from the textile mill, pushed forward with tears streaming down her weathered face. I said terrible things about you. I know sorry is not enough, but I need you to know that I am ashamed of who I became. We all are, added Magnus Hartwell, the innkeeper who had gossiped about Selvara to anyone who would listen. You were grieving your husband, and we made everything worse because we were too cowardly to question what we were told. Selvara looked at their faces, seeing genuine remorse mixed with the uncomfortable realization that they had been manipulated by people they trusted. Part of her wanted to unleash months of suppressed anger, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they had caused her. But that would be the old Selvara's choice, the woman who had measured her worth by other people's opinions. I forgive you, she said simply, and watched their faces transform with relief and surprise. Fear makes people cruel sometimes. The important thing is recognizing it and choosing to be better. Young Peter Moss, the boy whose leg Aldrich had helped break, limped forward on his healing limb. In his small hands, he carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the meadows outside town. These are for you, Peter said, his voice barely audible. To remember that Calethorn has beauty in it too, even if we forgot to show it to you. Selvara knelt to accept the flowers, bringing her eyes level with the child's. Thank you, Peter. These are the most beautiful flowers anyone has ever given me. The boy beamed with pride, and for a moment, Selvara could see the man he would become. Kinder than his parents, wiser than his community, shaped by witnessing both cruelty and redemption while he was still young enough to choose which path to follow. Elena Marsh stepped forward, holding her baby daughter Clara, who had supposedly been cursed by Selvara's glance. She never was cursed, Elena admitted quietly. She was hungry because we could barely afford food, and I was too proud to ask for help. I let you take the blame rather than face my own failures as a mother. Children cry, Selvara said gently. It does not mean they are cursed. It means they need love and care, which you clearly give her. Dr. Drake emerged from the back of the crowd, flanked by 2 royal constables, but allowed this final moment before being taken to prison. His thin face was hollow with shame and fear, but he managed to meet Selvara's eyes as he spoke. I want you to know that helping Thomas kill your husband is the worst thing I have ever done, Drake said, his voice shaking. I was weak and frightened, and a good man died because of my cowardice. I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for that sin. Selvara studied the broken man who had helped murder the person she loved most in the world. Justice demanded that he face punishment for his crimes, but justice also demanded that she not carry hatred in her heart like poison. Make your atonement by helping people instead of harming them, she said. That is the only way Bjorn's death can have any meaning. The constables led Drake away, and the crowd began to disperse, but not before each person found a way to say goodbye. Some offered small gifts. Others simply touched her hand briefly in a gesture of respect. Miriam Stone, who had made the cruelest accusations at the textile mill, pressed a small wooden carving into Selvara's palm. My late husband made this, Miriam said, not meeting her eyes. It is Saint Cordelia, the patron of travelers. She protects people on long journeys. When the crowd finally scattered, leaving only scattered flower petals and the lingering weight of words that could not be taken back, Selvara turned to find Aldrich watching her with an expression of quiet admiration. That was well done, he said. You gave them something they did not deserve and probably saved this town from years of guilt and self-hatred. They were not evil people, Selvara replied, tucking the small wooden saint into her bag beside Bjorn's letter. Just frightened ones who listened to the wrong voices. Now they have a chance to listen to better ones. She mounted the gray mare with practiced ease, her long legs finding the stirrups naturally. From horseback, she looked down at Calethorn spread below her like a map of her former life. The cottage where she had been happy and heartbroken. The mill where she had worked for wages that barely sustained life. The square where she had been publicly humiliated and privately redeemed. "Ready?" Aldrich asked, settling onto his black horse with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years in the saddle. Selvara took one final look at Bjorn's grave, visible in the distance as a small white stone among the oak trees. She whispered a goodbye that only the morning wind could hear, then turned her face toward the road that led away from everything she had ever known. "Ready," she said, and meant it completely. The mountain pass appeared before them like a gateway carved from living stone, its peaks scraping the belly of clouds that seemed close enough to touch. Selvara had never seen anything so magnificent or terrifying in her life. The road ahead wound between cliffs that rose on either side like the walls of some ancient cathedral, casting shadows deep enough to hide entire armies. "Beyond this pass lies Valdris," Aldrich said, his voice tight with emotions he was trying to control. "My home for the first 25 years of my life, and the place I have been avoiding for the last 20. They had been traveling for 6 days, following roads that grew narrower and steeper with each mile. Along the way, Selvara had begun to notice subtle changes in the world around them. The people they encountered in mountain villages were taller than those in the lowlands, with broader shoulders and longer limbs. The buildings were constructed with higher ceilings and wider doorways. Even the horses seemed built on a larger scale. But nothing had prepared her for what waited at the summit of the pass. Valdris spread below them like a jewel scattered across multiple mountainsides, its white stone buildings connected by graceful bridges that spanned impossible gaps between peaks. Gardens cascaded down terraced slopes in explosions of color that seemed to defy the thin mountain air. Waterfalls tumbled from heights that made Selvara dizzy to contemplate, feeding rivers that wound through the city like silver ribbons. And the people? Selvara had to blink several times to convince herself she was not dreaming. Men and women moved through Valdris's streets with the easy confidence of those who had never been made to feel ashamed of their size. They stood 7 feet tall, 8 feet, some even taller than Selvara herself. Children played games that would have required ladders in the lowlands, leaping between balconies and climbing walls with the casual athleticism of mountain goats. "It is beautiful," Selvara whispered, though the word felt inadequate for what she was seeing. "It is home," Aldrich replied, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice carried uncertainty. "But I do not know if they will still consider me family after so long away." As if summoned by his words, a group of riders appeared on the road ahead. They wore the blue and silver colors of Valdris, and even from a distance, Selvara could see that they were all built on the same impressive scale as the people in the city below. Their leader, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, spurred her horse forward. "Aldrich Thorn," the woman called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "You have been gone so long that some of us wondered if you had forgotten the way home." Aldrich dismounted and approached the woman with the careful steps of someone preparing for either an embrace or a blow. "Hello, Lionel. You look well." "I look old," Lionel replied, though her smile took the sting from her words. 20 years of governing a city in your absence will do that to a person. She was, Selvara realized, even taller than Aldrich, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her clothes were practical rather than ornate, but they were cut from cloth that cost more than most people earned in a year. Everything about her spoke of power wielded with wisdom and restraint. "I brought help," Aldrich said, gesturing toward Selvara. "This is Selvara Grimwald. She has agreed to consider whether Valdris might become her home." Lionel's sharp eyes assessed Selvara with the thoroughness of someone who had spent decades evaluating people's character and potential. She took in the travel-stained dress, the careful posture of someone accustomed to being stared at, and the quiet strength that radiated from Selvara like heat from a forge. "Grimwald," Lionel mused. "Related to Erasmus Grimwald, the mining investor?" "His nephew's widow," Selvara replied, surprised that her connection to Bjorn's uncle would be known so far from Calethorn. "Erasmus spoke of his family often during our business meetings." He would be pleased to know that his inheritance has found its way to someone who appreciates its true value. Lionel's smile became warmer, more genuine. Welcome to Valdris, Selvara Grimwald. I hope you will find it worthy of consideration. The group of riders formed an escort around them as they began the descent toward the city. As they drew closer, Selvara could see details that distance had hidden. The buildings were not just large, but beautiful, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories in stone. The bridges were engineering marvels that should have been impossible without magic, yet they had clearly been built by skilled hands and clever minds. How? Selvara asked, pointing toward a particularly spectacular span that connected two peaks across a gap that seemed to measure in miles rather than yards. Necessity, Lina answered. When our ancestors fled here, they were refugees seeking a place where they could live without persecution. The mountains provided safety but demanded innovation. We learned to build upward and across rather than outward. They passed through gates that stood 20 feet high, designed to accommodate people who would have seemed like giants in the lowlands. Guards nodded respectfully to Aldrich, their faces showing pleasure at his return mixed with curiosity about his companion. The streets of Valdris were unlike anything Selvara had ever experienced. For the first time in her adult life, she was not the tallest person in sight. Children looked up at her without fear or wonder, adults nodded politely without staring, and she began to understand what it felt like to simply blend into a crowd. The Council of Elders is waiting, Lina said as they approached a building that dominated the city's central square. They have questions about your plans and your companion. Aldrich's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course they do. They have waited 20 years for you to come home and accept your responsibilities, Aldrich. They want to be certain that this time you intend to stay. The building before them was clearly a seat of government, its facade decorated with symbols that spoke of justice, wisdom, and community. But it was also intimidating in the way that all centers of power tend to be, designed to remind visitors of their place in the larger scheme of things. Selvara felt her old fears beginning to surface. What if the Council of Elders found her unsuitable? What if they saw her as another lowland outsider who did not understand their ways? What if Aldrich's long absence had damaged his standing beyond repair? As if sensing her anxiety, Aldrich reached over and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady, anchoring her to the present moment rather than letting her drift into speculation about an uncertain future. Whatever happens in there, he said quietly, remember that you belong in this world. You are not asking for their permission to exist, Selvara. You are considering whether they deserve the gift of your presence. The massive doors of the council building swung open, revealing a chamber where 9 figures waited to decide not just Aldrich's fate, but Selvara's as well. She straightened to her full impressive height, called upon every lesson she had learned about surviving in a world that feared what it did not understand, and prepared to fight for the future she had never dared to dream was possible. The Council of Elders sat behind a curved table carved from a single piece of mountain oak, their faces grave with the weight of decisions that would shape Valdris for generations to come. Each elder was tall enough to command respect in any room, but their true power lay in eyes that had witnessed decades of triumph and tragedy, growth and loss, wisdom earned through experience rather than inherited through bloodlines. Selvara stood beside Aldrich in the center of the chamber, feeling the weight of their collective gaze like sunlight through a magnifying glass. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken finally by the eldest member of the council, a woman whose silver hair fell to her shoulders like a waterfall of moonlight. Aldrich Thorne, Elder Morwen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. You have been absent from Valdris for 20 years. In that time, we have governed in your stead, waiting for your return. Now you come back with a stranger and expect us to welcome you both as if no time has passed. I expect nothing, Aldrich replied, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his frame. I offer my service to Valdris, if the council believes I can still be useful. If not, Selvara and I will find another place to build our lives. Elder Thaddeus, a man whose weathered hand spoke of decades spent in manual labor before rising to leadership, leaned forward with interest. Tell us about this other life you have built in the lowlands. What have you learned that might benefit our people? For the next hour, Aldrich spoke of his travels and experiences. He described markets in distant cities where Valdris goods could find new buyers, trade routes that could bring prosperity to mountain communities, and innovations he had witnessed that could improve life for everyone. His knowledge was vast and practical, gained through years of careful observation and intelligent curiosity. But Selvara could see that the elders were not entirely convinced. 20 years was a long time to be absent from the place that needed your leadership, and trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. Elder Kasha, a woman whose stern expression reminded Selvara of old teachers who accepted no excuses, turned her attention to the newest arrival. Selvara Grimwald, you come from the lowlands, where our people are seen as freaks and monsters. Why should we believe you understand what it means to belong to Valdris? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Selvara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from being judged by people who had already decided her worth. But this time, instead of shrinking from scrutiny, she chose to meet it head-on. Because I know what it feels like to be the only one, Selvara said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. I have lived my entire adult life as the tallest person in every room, the strongest woman in every group, the one who made others uncomfortable simply by existing. I know what it means to have children throw stones at you because your size frightens them. I know what it means to love someone who has to defend his choice to be with you. I know what it means to be blamed for every misfortune that occurs within a day's ride of your home. She paused, letting her words settle, then continued with growing conviction. But I also know what it means to survive that treatment without becoming bitter. I know what it means to choose kindness when the world offers you cruelty. I know what it means to protect people who hate you simply because it is the right thing to do. Elder Damon, the youngest member of the council, spoke for the first time. Those are admirable qualities, but Valdris needs leaders who understand our specific challenges. We are not just tall people living in isolation. We are a community built by refugees who created something beautiful from nothing. Can you truly understand that experience? Selvara thought of Calethorn, of Thomas Blackwood's conspiracy, of the townspeople who had finally found the courage to apologize for their cruelty. She thought of Bjorn's grave and the life she had chosen to leave behind. Most of all, she thought of the moment when Aldrich had offered her a choice that no one else had ever given her. I understand that sometimes the only way to build something beautiful is to start over completely, she said. I understand that survival requires both strength and wisdom, both individual courage and community support. I understand that the people who create safe places for themselves have a responsibility to keep those places safe for others. Elder Morwen exchanged glances with her colleagues, conducting some silent conversation that excluded both visitors. Finally, she stood and walked around the table to face Selvara directly. Show me your hands, Morwen commanded. Selvara extended her hands palm up, confused by the request. Morwen examined them carefully, tracing the calluses that spoke of years spent in manual labor, the small scars that told stories of survival and sacrifice. These are hands that have worked, Morwen announced to the council. Hands that have built things, grown things, protected things. Not the soft hands of someone who expects others to serve her. She turned to examine Aldrich's hands with the same thoroughness, finding similar evidence of a life spent in useful labor rather than idle luxury. The law requires our leaders to be married, Elder Thaddeus observed. Are you prepared to fulfill that requirement? Aldrich looked at Selvara, and in his eyes she saw not expectation or pressure, but simple invitation. The choice was hers to make, without coercion or manipulation. If Selvara will have me, Aldrich said quietly, I would be honored to call her my wife and my partner in all things. Selvara felt the weight of the moment settling around her like snow, beautiful and transforming. 6 months ago, she had been a widow facing exile and destitution. Now she stood in a mountain city among people who looked like her, being offered the chance to help govern a community that valued strength and wisdom over conformity and fear. Yes, she said, the word carrying all the hope and determination she had been afraid to feel. Yes, I will marry you, and yes, I will help you lead Valdris if the council believes we are worthy. Elder Morwen smiled for the first time since they had entered the chamber. Then let us discuss the challenges facing our city and see if you are prepared to help us solve them. What followed was not a test, but a conversation, a sharing of ideas and concerns that lasted until the mountain sun painted the chamber walls gold. Selvara found herself contributing thoughts and solutions, drawing on experiences from Calethorn that proved surprisingly relevant to Valdris's needs. When the council finally voted, it was unanimous. 3 months later, Selvara stood on the highest balcony in Valdris, wearing a wedding dress made from mountain silk that fit her perfectly without alteration. Below her, the city spread out like a promise fulfilled, its people celebrating the marriage of their returned leader to the lowland woman who had chosen to make their struggles her own. Aldrich joined her at the railing, resplendent in blue and silver that marked him as Valdris's rightful governor. In his hands, he carried a letter that had arrived that morning from Calethorn. "News from your old home," he said, offering her the folded paper. "Magnus Hartwell writes that Thomas Blackwood was captured trying to cross the border with stolen gold. He will face justice after all." Selvara read the letter with satisfaction, pleased that the final loose thread had been tied off. But when she looked up from the paper, her attention was caught by something far more important than news of old enemies. A group of children played in the square below, their laughter echoing off the stone walls like music. They were all tall for their ages, as children in Valdris tended to be, but they played together without any sense that their size made them different or wrong. "Look," Selvara said, pointing toward the children. "Look how free they are." Aldrich followed her gaze and smiled with the contentment of a man who had finally found his way home. "That is what we are building here. A place where being different is not the same as being wrong." As the celebration continued below them, Selvara thought of Bjorn's letter, still kept carefully in her belongings, where he had promised they would travel together someday to see mountains and oceans. She had seen the mountains now, and from Valdris's highest peaks, she could sometimes glimpse the distant ocean glittering like scattered diamonds. "Thank you," she whispered to the memory of her first love, "for teaching me that I deserve to be loved completely." Then she turned to her new husband, her partner in all things, and prepared to spend the rest of her life proving that giants could be gentle, strangers could become family, and broken hearts could grow back stronger than before. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Selvara Grimwald Thorn stood tall and proud in a city built for people like her, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. In the distance, thunder rumbled with the promise of gentle rain. Like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories of courage, love, and finding where you truly belong. Every person deserves a place where they can stand tall and be celebrated for exactly who they are.